Good evening, members of the judiciary, colleagues and friends, and I even spotted a relative. Hi, Anne. We'll just give people a minute to access the Zoom because there's over 220 people registered, so we'll just let people have a chance to join in. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the annual gathering of the extended FLAC family. It would be so much nicer to have it in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do that next year. At this event, we normally honor the FLAC volunteers, but it just didn't seem right to do it online, and we will do it again properly when we can. However, I'm really delighted that their very important work has been publicly recognised by Volunteer Ireland and that they've been shortlisted for an award, which is brilliant. This lecture is in memory of a great friend of FLAC and Access to Justice warrior, Dave Ellis. And I especially want to welcome Dave's wife, Sarah Flynn, who's watching this with Stacia and Geraldine, and also Dave's brother, Brian and Lucille Ellis. I think Dave would be particularly animated by Professor de Búrca's presentation, and I'd love to hear his take on recent events. I also want to take this opportunity to say a huge congratulations to former FLAC Chairperson Siobhan Phelan, who's been appointed a High Court judge. Everybody knows that Siobhan is a fantastic, formidable lawyer with enormous courage, and we at FLAC and others have benefited hugely from her generous expertise and are left a little reeling as we feel there's no one like her, but we are thrilled for her personally and for her appointment, which almost restores your faith in the system. Due to the restrictions, we haven't had a chance yet to celebrate and mark properly Peter Ward's incredible contribution, stewardship and guidance to FLAC from over many years. He was able to step down this year as chairperson when our new chairperson, David Fennelly, was ever so gently persuaded to step up. And we're very grateful and lucky that he did, but by now he may be feeling that it wasn't quite the leisurely stroll in the park that he was promised. So I hope tonight's events will bring some consolation. But I want to genuinely and personally thank David and all the FLAC Council, Julie Hurley, Joanne Hyde, Don Crew and Peter, for their very hidden but very vital, valuable and quite onerous and responsible work and support. I also want to thank FLAC staff for an amazing, difficult and hyper busy year. And it's an honor and privilege to work with such a great bunch of very talented people. David teaches in the law school in Trinity and is the author of tons of learned articles and is also an extremely busy practicing barrister. FLAC solicitors were dismayed that they could no longer brief him when he was appointed chair in March. So we've had a double whammy in losing David and now Siobhan. While David is going to introduce Professor de Búrca, I have to admit to being completely in awe of her, having happily copied and pasted from her brilliant textbooks into legal submissions and opinions for years, and I don't think I'm the only one. David.
Thanks so much, Eilish, and good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for joining the FLAC Annual Justice Lecture in memory of Dave Ellis. And we're delighted, as Eilish said, this year to be joined by Professor Gráinne de Búrca to give tonight's lecture. Before formally introducing Gráinne, I want to say a few short words by way of introduction. First, I'd like to echo Eilish's thanks, and in particular to the volunteers who are so vital to FLAC's work, whether it's assisting on the phone lines, the information line, as FLAC clinics have moved online in the COVID world, barristers who acting pro bono for FLAC, including Siobhan, that Eilish mentioned, who's made an invaluable contribution to FLAC over the years, as well as many other colleagues, and also others who contribute in hugely important ways, including through the Public Interest Law Alliance. Without your contribution, FLAC would not be able to do its work. And Gráinne's topic this evening on mobilising for human rights in Ireland is something that's very close to our hearts in FLAC. Since FLAC was founded in 1969, it has been campaigning, particularly to promote access to justice in Ireland. The early campaigns in the 70s, combined with the landmark Erie case before the European Court of Human Rights, led to the introduction of a civil legal aid system in Ireland. And while this represented a very important step forward, we know that there remain significant gaps in access to justice in Ireland today. And against that backdrop, We very much welcome the Minister for Justice's commitment to a review of the civil legal aid system, which FLAC has campaigned for many years. For FLAC, it's essential that this is a meaningful review, ideally chaired by an independent chair, providing a blueprint for a fair, modern, and accessible legal aid system. And of course, access to justice has many dimensions. Civil legal aid is one vital part, but there are others. And this year, FLAC was delighted to participate in the Chief Justice's Access to Justice Working Group, which brings together for the first time key stakeholders to reflect on some of these issues. One important element too is making the court process accessible. And in this regard, we understand that work is underway at present on implementing the very significant Kelly review on the administration of civil justice. There is much that we in FLAC welcome in that review, particularly in its emphasis on the modernization and simplification of the court process. But FLAC does have very serious concerns about the recommendations in relation to judicial review. We know from bitter experience that efforts to restrict judicial review, for example, in areas such as immigration and planning, have tended only to increase the time and cost associated with litigation in those areas. This in itself is a reason for caution in bringing about similar or more stringent restrictions across the board. But much more fundamentally, there is a real risk that any significant curtailment of judicial review would undermine what is an essential safeguard to the rule of law in our democracy, as well as raising issues of consistency with European and international law. We're very fortunate in Ireland to have a robust and independent justice system with a robust and independent judiciary and legal profession. Recent events elsewhere in Europe and beyond remind us that these systems, in which judicial review plays such an important part, must not be taken for granted. In FLAC's work, access to justice is important in its own right, but it's particularly important as a gateway for the protection of human rights and equality. And this is an area where Ireland has shown great leadership in many respects. But our equality laws in particular require modernisation to reflect the Ireland of 2021 and beyond. And with this in mind, FLAC welcomes the review of the equality law infrastructure announced by Minister Roderick O'Gorman earlier this year. In recent weeks, alongside the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, FLAC has been working closely with NGOs and community groups around the country to support an active engagement with this review. Of course, the real test for the review will be in its outcomes and implementation, and this will require ongoing mobilisation by FLAC and civil society more generally. And coming back to why we're here tonight, all of this underlines the importance of the topic that Gráinne has chosen for tonight's lecture. Gráinne de Búrca is Florence Ellinwood Allen Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Hauser Global Law School Program at New York University School of Law. After graduating from UCD and the University of Michigan and the King's Inns, Gráinne's distinguished academic career has taken her to the University of Oxford, onwards to the European University Institute in Florence, and then to Fordham Law School and Harvard Law School before taking up her current role. And Gráinne's name is, of course, a byword for excellence and authority in European Union law, but her scholarship spans far beyond that field. And in particular, Gráinne's recent book, Reframing Human Rights for a Turbulent Era, provides a compelling defense of the role and relevance of human rights at a time of great challenge around the world. What's unique about this book is the way in which it brings together the local and the global, the theory and the practice, to illustrate how human rights play a critical role in bringing about social and political change. And of special relevance to the work of FLAC and our partners is the way in which the book underlines the importance of civil society organisation and activists, including the late Dave Ellis, who we remembered this evening, in this process. We know from direct experience that it's a process that is rarely easy or straightforward. It's often messy and meandering, but as Gráinne argues in this book, it is more important than ever today. And in this way, I think the book is infused with great humanity, which indeed epitomizes Gráinne, because as well as being an exceptional scholar, Gráinne is also a gifted teacher and a very generous mentor. So on behalf of FLAC, I'd like you to join me in giving a very warm welcome to Gráinne de Búrca and thank her for joining us for tonight's lecture. Gráinne is going to speak for around 30 minutes and will then hopefully have some time for questions and answers. Gráinne, the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much, David, for those very kind words of introduction. I can say David was an excellent student too, but it's wonderful to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to give the annual FLAC lecture and to honor David Ellis in so doing. The work that FLAC does in Ireland and has done for so many decades has been really crucial, I think, and as David said in his introduction, is all the more crucial today, given the times we're living in. So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to give this lecture. I'm going to share a screen with you, a PowerPoint screen, in part because I speak rather fast and for the sake of the interpreter, I would like to do that, but also maybe to give a bit of structure to my comments. So let me begin by talking about, as David mentioned, the reason why I wrote a recent book on human rights in a turbulent era. And one of the reasons, there were many reasons, but one was because I became frustrated with many of the recent critiques of human rights, the challenges that were being put forward from all sides of the political spectrum, but interestingly, in recent years, very much from the left, from the progressive end of the political spectrum. Arguments that the end times of human rights are here and that we shouldn't be wasting our time on this category of social justice action, the advancement of human rights. And amongst the many critiques that have been made and to which I was trying to respond in my book were that human rights are ineffective, they're very managerial and bureaucratic, they're a kind of a top-down intervention imposed from above by courts, by international bodies, by elites and so on. And more damningly, that they're unable to address the real challenges of our times, for example, inequality or socioeconomic injustice. So the book I wrote undertook a number of studies of human rights campaigns around the world. And two of those were studies of human rights campaigns in Ireland. The others looked at disability rights activism in Argentina and gender justice movements and movements against gender violence in Pakistan. But I also looked at two examples in Ireland, one of which was child rights advocacy and the other was reproductive rights advocacy. And I did that. I undertook these various studies to try to show and to make an argument as to how human rights advocacy does make a difference in advancing social justice around the world, but also in Ireland in particular. And in some ways you might think, well, Ireland, these are difficult times, FLAC and the work FLAC does on behalf of the marginalized and those who are whose causes are ignored, who don't have access to justice, who are often at the margins of society, that despite that and the obvious injustices that exist in Ireland, as in every country, nonetheless, Ireland has been seen as something, I think, of a beacon for constitutional reform and human rights change in recent years, partly as a result of some of its high-profile successes, for example, the reproductive rights campaigns and marriage equality and so on. And in many ways, Ireland is a beacon. It's in a very turbulent world at present. It remains a stable democracy with largely civilized political discourse. Those of you who are living there may disagree with me on that and say maybe less civilized sometimes than others, but nonetheless, there's respect for human rights. There's plenty of room for civil society action. And in the case of some of these recent campaigns I mentioned, there's evidence that it's possible to turn around entrenched social prejudices and views and so on through active campaigning and engaged human rights advocacy. So Ireland as something of a beacon in that respect. It's always nice to hear that. Nevertheless, as David mentioned again in his introduction, these are very challenging times, and we're living in changing international and domestic times, I would say. Globally and internationally, I think all of you will know we're living in an era of rising illiberalism. And by that, I mean not just authoritarian states growing more powerful and states becoming fully authoritarian, but even within many, familiar traditional democratic systems in France, in Germany, in Italy, elsewhere, there are really significant far-right movements, illiberal movements, movements against rights, against minorities, against democracy, against liberal democracy in particular. And we see these growing all around us. And they're, this is happening not just in Europe, but in all continents of the world. We also see withdrawal from international organizations. I mean, Brexit might be our most present one in Ireland, but there are many others. Withdrawals from international courts like the ICC, or from threats to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, withdrawal from other kinds of international treaties, and more generally a backlash against human rights in many parts of the world. So these currents and winds of change are on the rise, are growing. This isn't a temporary or passing phenomenon in my view. So one question is, Ireland has appeared as a kind of a beacon, standing out in some ways against this tide of change. Is Ireland in some way immune from or sheltered from these developments? I mean, my own sense is that's very unlikely. For now, we're very lucky, I think, that Ireland remains such a stable and civilized political system with a commitment to constitutional law and to human rights and so on. But like everywhere, there is the rise of far-right movements even within Ireland, new, more authoritarian type political parties on the rise, some violence in the anti-pandemic restriction marches and so on. So there are trends everywhere, and it would be, I think, a mistake to assume that any country is fully immune from what's happening in the tide of illiberalism worldwide. So that's just by way of a kind of a cautionary note. Nevertheless, and looking on the positive side, my aim in looking at human rights campaigns around the world, including in Ireland, was to try to develop a kind of a sort of a theory, an explanation, an account of what it is that makes for successful human rights advocacy. And I call it an experimentalist account, and based on the studies that I did, including children's rights advocacy and reproductive rights reform in Ireland, I suggest that effective human rights campaigning successful human rights campaigns seemed to have involved a kind of an ongoing, what I call iterative, really ongoing, a cycle of engagement and interaction between three broad groups of actors and institutions, domestically and internationally, internally and externally. And the three broad clusters of actors are, on the one hand, the domestic activists, the advocates, the social movements, and that's a broad array already there. But those who identify the rights and claim them, who bring them to attention, who raise public awareness and support, who protest, who publicize, who name and claim the rights, on the one hand. The second group then are these external actors, the international institutions like courts, the European Court of Human Rights, or sometimes the Court of Justice, treaty bodies, all the major international treaties like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or economic and social rights, rights of persons with disabilities, discrimination against women, and so on. There's a whole array of international treaties with bodies there to monitor the compliance with these treaties. There's the Universal Periodic Review, There are special rapporteurs, commissions. There's a whole array of international actors and institutions committed to human rights enforcement and monitoring. And what do they do? Well, they provide what I call an external accountability forum. So, contrary to the criticisms that say, well, human rights are kind of these top-down things, they're enforced on us by these elite, hierarchical actors. I see these international institutions as not very strong. In fact, they don't have enforcement powers. What they are is kind of forums for accountability. They bring the relevant actors, they highlight the domestic issues, they require governments to justify themselves, to explain themselves, to account for themselves in the public sphere. They help to articulate and develop and present and reinforce the international norms, the human rights, the relevant standards as they're changing and evolving in reaction to practice. And they bring these various actors together, the activists, the governments, other kinds of interested third parties, in a forum to kind of hash it out. But that I found in my studies, including looking at Ireland, and this was particularly marked with the reproductive rights campaign, that it wasn't really enough. You might think, well, domestic activism is enough, but often it turned out that wasn't, because these are often causes that are deeply unpopular or neglected, or for some reason are stuck. Things that these are movements which really take a lot of work before change comes about. So the domestic campaigns often need that additional help from the external accountability forum, the international institutions. And they also have the effect of placing the domestic campaign in a global context, showing that these are universal ideas, the rights in question, they're shared by others. Ireland is an outlier on this, where they're really off the track in terms of compliance with these norms. So that helps the domestic movement a lot. And similarly, the international institutions couldn't survive or have any role without the domestic activists who inform them, who bring the issues, who identify the rights, who help them evolve and develop the norms and so on. But the third group then, I found that even that back and forth between the domestic and the international still is often not enough, because the government comes back after defending itself, or after the Universal Periodic Review, and then shelves the issue and quietly goes on with its priorities. So often campaigns have to be ongoing, and they need the help of other kinds of actors and institutions at the domestic level. And here I think is where national courts, agencies, the ombudspersons, opposition actors, independent media is a really important actor, actually, as much as the courts, in providing ongoing pressure, traction, keeping up the sort of the campaign, and giving leverage points to activists to continue to bring back the output of those international forums and so on. And so this seemed to be really important to mention, that this third set of actors interacts with the other two in this kind of cycle over time, and often a repeated cycle of engagement. So that's just that slide is an elaborated version of what I've just described. But that's what I've called the experimentalist account of international human rights advocacy, or even of international human rights reform. So, in the case of Ireland, in the case of the abortion campaign, in the case of the children's rights campaigns and so on, what it took was a very long time for some of the changes, but a constant emphasis on domestic mobilization, generating support, attention, and so on. Then going to these, when no success was reached, going to these international fora. And what those would do often is not deliver the answer or enforce something by magic, but rather to highlight something like, really, Ireland stands out. Ireland is beyond, outside of the array of kind of accepted interpretations of the right to health or bodily integrity or privacy or reproductive health and so on. But also to bring back then the array of litigants, the women in question in the case of abortion reform in Ireland, was putting a face to the issue. So abortion moved from being a kind of an unsayable taboo, you know, an unspeakable wrong, to something that everyone's friends, daughters, parents, sisters were affected by. So something that where people whose real stories of human suffering were kind of brought to attention. So that was one of the functions of these international litigation efforts. So people like Siobhan, Amanda Mellett and Siobhan Whelan and others, the ABC cases and X cases, even when they remained as letters, the stories of these women were, you know, highlighted by these international accountability forums and so on, and then became part of the domestic discussion, debate, and change. So the question is, having sort of examined these various successful campaigns, and the campaign for children's rights was also very successful, and over time using the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Universal Periodic Review and many domestic campaigning points to really bring about constitutional change, policy change, you know, the Ombudsperson for Children, institutional change, Tulsa and other kinds of institutions were established. But in some ways you could think, well, maybe even though they were socially divisive in some ways, these were also less difficult groups to campaign for. You know, everyone can identify with children. You know, there are maybe certain groups of children that are more ostracized or marginalized, children in prison or children of traveling communities and so on. But on the other hand, children's rights in general, it's easy to kind of translate that into popular support. And similarly, even if abortion was so divisive for so long in Ireland, women are a very broad and you know, unavoidable kind of group category in society, and it's easier to kind of generate collective support. But what about unpopular minorities? So how do these lessons, the lessons of, you know, human rights mobilization and reform and so on work in relation to groups that are marginalized or whose issues or causes are silent for other reasons, like travelers, like refugees, like maybe trans persons, where there's still a lot of societal prejudice and where there's a lot of injustice. And I think one of the lessons of the various studies that I did was that it's incredibly important, alongside legal campaigns, alongside the campaigns of the advocates and the campaigns for justice, to build social support, to figure out ways of building social support for the campaigns, because very often the changes in social attitudes are absolutely crucial in order to make the legal change, first of all, in order for it to happen, but secondly, even if legal change is brought about, it can remain like paper change or just formal change if there isn't a change in social attitudes too. So that, you know, was a very important lesson, I think, of the various campaigns that I looked at. Sorry, for some reason, so that's one set of challenges in what I'm calling, you know, not necessarily a different era, but certainly an era in which there is more hostility maybe expressed. There's the rise, as I said, of illiberal attitudes and more overt expression of those. There's plenty of online hate in the case of, you know, so-called despised minorities and so on. So these are difficult issues where changing social attitudes is going to be a key part of any successful campaign. So then a second category of what, you know, I'd call contemporary challenges, where there might be reason to question whether the success of earlier human rights campaigns, you know, are likely to be replicated. And one of those would be socioeconomic inequality, what I'd call structural changes. So socioeconomic inequality being one kind of set of human rights issues, social justice issues, that really is a very deep-seated problem and requires a very deep sort of structural set of responses. And the other that I'm suggesting is the climate crisis, which is a massive, overwhelming challenge facing everyone everywhere, including in Ireland these days, and which similarly seems to require really fundamental thinking. And so, what, in the previous slide, I was asking whether there might be reason to question the success of the campaigns for women and children when we think about the minorities against whom there's far more societal discrimination, or the so-called despised minorities. In this case, it's less the issue of discrimination or social prejudice and more, the really sort of fundamental nature of the challenges, that in order to tackle these issues, I think something more than, again, just a legal campaign conducted mainly by lawyers is needed. And one of the responses often to referring to climate change in the same context as human rights is to say, or even environmental issues, is these aren't human rights issues, or climate and environment is one thing, human rights are these individual, freedom of expression and right to life and all the classical ones. But increasingly, the environment and climate, as two very closely related sets of issues, are actually treated as a human rights issue. And so, just even more formally speaking, there are conventions like the Aarhus Convention in Europe or the Escazú Convention in the Americas, where there's a recognition of environmental rights as rights. So particularly the procedural rights to participate in issues of environmental consequence, rights of access to justice, and that's the sort of legal end of it, and rights of information, that these are actually human rights. They affect people deeply, and they may be collective in nature rather than individual, but they nevertheless can be and are to be conceived of in human rights terms. And relatedly, apart from those conventions and the procedural kind of environmental rights, we have the cascade of climate litigation all around the world at present, invoking human rights and building challenges to the inaction of governments around human rights issues. So I think there are many different human rights dimensions to these two issues. They're not just human rights issues, but they are certainly also those. And here I just want to sort of raise the question of whether maybe a number of recent developments suggest that there might be less room for optimism in Ireland, that campaigns, human rights-based campaigns might have effect, because we've seen a number of developments. There's the Supreme Court case on climate mitigation, which was successful insofar as the climate mitigation plan was found to be inadequate, but where the NGO, the Friends of the Irish Environment, was held not to have standing to challenge, to bring cases invoking constitutional rights or rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. Again, a kind of a conception of this very individualized notion of rights as, for an individual litigant and so on, to bring, and also the idea that there isn't really, there aren't really unenumerated environmental rights to be found in the Irish Constitution. A second development that gives less room for optimism is again, the same litigant, a really impressive organization, Friends of the Irish Environment, which has done incredible work with very few resources over the years in a context in Ireland in which, development has been rampant and often uncontrolled, and there are very few counter voices able to argue successfully for the environment, where the power in a way of those on the side of economic development was far greater than those trying to argue for more considered planning and for taking environmental interests more fundamentally into account. So the denial of legal aid to Friends of the Irish Environment is another sort of cause for less optimism, I think, if we're trying to think of whether there's room for successful human rights campaigning in this field in Ireland. And then the third one, which I think David adverted to already in his introductory comments, is the issue of, again, access to justice, that with proposals on the table at present to limit judicial review, and particularly in the case of climate and environmental issues, to move from an issue of significant effect to substantial effect, would further narrow the possibility of bringing legal action to try to enforce some of these really fundamental issues. So those are some cautionary or less optimistic notes maybe about whether Ireland is at present anyway, given legal and political developments, likely to to provide fertile ground for climate-based human rights campaigns, or human rights-based climate campaigns. With socioeconomic inequality, one of the issues I wanted to mention was that here, I know that with the review of equality law, there's thought about adding a ground of discrimination on the basis of socioeconomic status, and I think this is an important symbolic move, and maybe could be an important practical one too. But I wonder whether that really is likely to be adequate in terms of the challenges of socioeconomic inequality. And so here again, going back to my earlier argument, I want to suggest that maybe an important, not alternative necessarily, but complementary strategy would be to try to build broader public support for the actual substantive economic and social rights involved. So rather than just thinking about it from a discrimination perspective, even though that's also important, but the rights to recognize housing, healthcare, and going back to the Supreme Court case, and environmental issues as rights, and to try to mobilize to develop greater popular support for those moves. And I think there is room for this in Ireland at present. So I'm just going to wrap up in order to allow, I think, some time for questions at the end. But just to bring together some of the points I've been making, is that the first one, just drawing from the studies I did for the book, that as I said, the crucial elements for a successful human rights campaign tend to include this ongoing engagement, ongoing campaigns that involve not only domestic institutions, but also, and domestic actors, but also international or external forums and actors in this kind of ongoing discursive and kind of interactive engagement. And that at present, I started off saying that Ireland is kind of a model political system at present, and I think that's still true. There's really strong civic space there. We don't have these things happening in so many parts of the world, the defunding and closing down of NGOs, and then the even more repressive measures, the harassment and bringing actions against them, all the way up to disappearances and killings, which we see in so many parts of the world. But it's still important, I think, to keep an eye out for other kinds of attempts to weaken civil society, to reduce civic space in maybe more less obvious and less radical ways. But nonetheless, I think seeing NGOs as somehow bothersome or as frivolous or vexatious litigants, rather than actors who are bringing a voice in for those who don't have a voice, or in the case of the environment and climate, where the individualized conception of rights would exclude that kind of voice. So I think that's important to keep an eye on. I think it's very important in the current era, even while Ireland remains really far ahead and much better shape than many other parts of the world, to anticipate and strategize, to think about the likely factors of resistance, like the growing far-right movements and resistance from conservative legal and political forces. There has to be, a sort of a strategizing about those. really importantly, then the last 2 points, which are related, and this is the one I've made several times, but that legal campaigns for human rights reform and social justice really need to be accompanied. I think this is the lesson I saw from all the different studies I did of different countries. They really need to be accompanied by broader campaigns to change attitudes and build social support. That's not to say that an NGO like FLAC or any NGO can do that work, but they can work in tandem with, they can try to work alongside or to help others to generate and build social movements, and to try to work with them. Because if a legal campaign is not underpinned by that kind of deeper societal support, I think either it's less likely to be successful, or even if legal reform is achieved, it's less likely to translate into actual reform in practice, implemented on the ground reform. And the final point then is just that these major contemporary structural challenges like socioeconomic inequality and climate change, they do need input from lawyers and from courts, but they also need a lot more than that. And these are areas where there's really a need for building social movements, for a broader democratic push, and for bringing about the kind of change in attitudes and in public support that will then help courts and lawyers to play the important supporting role that they can too. So I think I'm going to stop there and stop sharing and just hand over to see whether there are any questions.
Super, thanks so much, Gráinne. That was a fascinating lecture and an insight into the book, and I commend the book to everybody to just really get the depth of the analysis and insight that you've shared with us in the lecture. If anybody would like to ask any questions, feel free to place them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to share them with Gráinne. So Mary's asked a question, Gráinne, about, said, we're fortunate that NGOs are not targeted by the state. In fact, they're very often funded by the state to provide versions of services that the state should more rightly provide. How does that type of structure reduce effective protection of human rights where NGOs may not be adequately funded or have adequate reach to truly provide the services that are needed? So that's obviously an important issue here in Ireland, but more generally in terms of NGOs stepping into the breach where the state may be neglecting its responsibilities. Any thoughts on that one, Gráinne? Or?
Sorry, I may have missed the very beginning of it, David. Was it the question of the funding, so that the state isn't targeting NGOs but is not adequately supporting them? Yeah, I think that was the point I was trying to get to at the end, that, you know, to keep an eye out for that, I think sometimes what I do sense is maybe an intolerance of, or a sense that, you know, NGOs are getting too much space, too much airtime, they're distorting issues and so on. Whereas I think that really this is something that Ireland might be in a much better place than so many other parts of the world in terms of not actively harassing, shutting down or silencing these, but by failing to support NGOs, and especially ones where there's clear evidence of their public interest work, of their dedication to the public interest. They're not just recently set up in order to advance particular commercial interests or some kind of special pleading, but really these are public interests. These are either marginalized or silenced groups, or groups without adequate resources, or, as in the case of many of these kinds of environmental groups, they're representing an interest that got really, you know, sidelined for far too long at cost to everyone, to the whole population. So I completely agree with that, and that the issue of funding, of legal aid, of adequate support, and so on is a really important one to look at. Many fairly, you know, robust, or what we would have thought of as robust democracies in Europe are introducing laws, you know, for example, criminalizing aid to asylum seekers. I mean, that's a particularly horrible trend in Europe at the moment. But, you know, that is one, you see it in France, you see it in Greece, you see it in Italy, you know, that introducing the idea that the work done by NGOs in politically disfavored areas, like helping asylum seekers, becomes criminal. That's the kind of thing I think that really needs to be watched closely for, and similarly, failing to provide adequate support. It may not be doing what Orban is doing and trying to get the open society shut out of the country, but these are smaller steps and insidious steps in their own ways, I think, that do limit the effectiveness of what I think are really important actors in the whole social justice area.
Thanks so much, Gráinne. Michelle has a question for us on asking whether there are any international examples of success that you've come across in tackling socioeconomic discrimination, either through anti-discrimination legislation or through non-legal campaigns or avenues.
So that was one of my big regrets towards the end of the book, was thinking I should have, all of the kinds of rights I was looking at. So there were disability rights campaigns for inclusive education in Argentina, and then some of the gender justice campaigns in Pakistan were also covered a range of family law, inheritance issues, and so on, with socioeconomic implications. But I didn't do any direct socioeconomic rights studies, and I think that's a really important area. It's certainly an area where there's a lot of skepticism. When I started the lecture, I talked about one of the big critiques is, human rights have done nothing for socioeconomic inequality. They've kind of gone along with and accompanied widening inequality. And so that's a major criticism that's made of the international human rights movement. But, there are all kinds of interesting campaigns. Some of the campaigns for access to, HIV treatments in South Africa is one of the really well-known and famous examples of, a human rights social justice movement that really did bring about distributive change in important ways. But there are also a host of organizations, a very impressive one it's actually based in New York, is the Center for Economic and Social Rights, that's engaged in all kinds of socioeconomic campaigns in different parts of the world. And, I wouldn't say any of them has overthrown, neoliberal capitalism, if we want to put it at its strongest, but they have had, there have been successes in particular campaigns and in specific kinds of areas. So health and education are two particular categories, I think, where there's been quite a bit of progress. But I do agree that that's actually an area in which far more work needs to be done, partly to, I think, respond. I think some of the critiques are actually right. It is true to say that socioeconomic rights have been really the poor cousin of civil and political rights, and that far more work needs to be done. And that not enough progress was made. But I think there are many actors around the world. Latin America has had a lot of socioeconomic rights mobilization and various kinds of successes. And I think the challenge is to really build on those and to push for recognition of socioeconomic rights. They're recognized in law internationally. They're simply not taken seriously and implemented in practice by states. And I think that's where there's a lot of really important advocacy work to be done.
Thanks, Gráinne. And sometimes the compartments themselves can block our thinking about these things ourselves. And your comments there, especially about access to HIV treatment, remind me of a former annual justice lecturer, Edwin Cameron, who spoke to us again recently, and it was very involved in that movement. And of course, at the moment, access to vaccines raises really challenging issues as well. Gráinne, Patricia has a question asking if you have any thoughts on how to respond when the international human rights bodies act as a negative rather than a positive influence. For example, Patricia references the retreat of the ECHR in recent years on the rights of migrants under Article 8. Any thoughts on that?
That's a really good point. And one of the many challenges of the illiberal era, and that is that the bodies we used to think of as highly progressive are themselves not necessarily being captured, but certainly coming under sustained pressure from states to to backtrack and to limit their rulings. And the ECHR has undoubtedly in a number of areas engaged in this sort of self-restraint backtracking. And, you know, again, it's a difficult one because to the extent that both the people being nominated to these bodies and courts and so on are themselves less progressive or, you know, reflecting the interests of the governments that nominated them. And also to the extent that they feel the pressure from the states parties more generally that they will, you know, withdraw from, disempower the court, limit its powers and so on, they often do restrain themselves and, as you say, have moved to more conservative positions. One of the things that I suggest in the last chapter of the book where I'm discussing that problem is to sort of think about the pluralism of the international human rights system and to look if one venue becomes conservative or captured or moves backwards, to shift to others. So often, for example, special procedures, you know, a special rapporteur, an individual special rapporteur, again, like many of these actors or bodies, has very little power other than the international attention they can draw to something, the shining the spotlight, the providing those resources to the domestic activists. I think, you know, special rapporteurs on racism, on socioeconomic inequality, on all kinds of, on digital issues in recent years have done incredible work in helping domestic advocates and activists to pursue their causes. So I think you're right. You need to be attentive to these forums and think, okay, where is the best one? Where will I? Sometimes they're unexpected, you know, that if you can't go any longer or you don't want to go to the ECHR, that maybe the UNHCR or the Commissioner of the Council of Europe or one of these other sort of sources of international pressure and authority and so on might be better. But it's a big problem, and it's part of the problem of not, you know, I wouldn't be complacent about anything in this particular era, you know, so to really scrutinize closely who's being nominated and appointed to these bodies, to just keep an eye on all the important avenues, because to the extent that we have a healthy, well-working international human rights system, it really relies on the domestic, the international bodies themselves not being captured. That's why and even less than captured, just being intimidated maybe by the political environment and losing some of their independence.
Thanks, Gráinne. I find that one of the really excellent parts of the book, just in bringing those elements together and showing how in the particular case studies you look at, you have to shift your focus over time according to the response and so on. And that's why I think your approach, which is just not found elsewhere, really does offer some very useful insight for practitioners as well as scholars. A question about the teaching of human rights law, Gráinne, for you as a teacher, what do you see as being the most important message to convey to our students, the human rights lawyers and advocates of the future, given the contemporary challenges that you've mentioned?
So I would, you know, I think there's two messages. They may seem slightly in tension with each other, but, you know, the first is not to lose faith in human rights, like to really remember how important many of the achievements of human rights movements and campaigns have been in far more illiberal times than ours at present, you know, in the worst of times, under military dictatorships, you know, under Nazi, you know, the Nazi era, all kinds of horrendous circumstances. People have risen up and have, or secretly, you know, pursued campaigns for recognizing human rights and to promote and realize these. So to really not lose sight of that and to not become jaded or cynical or dismissive of such a powerful set of ideas, the idea that we all are, as human beings, share certain innate rights, and that those we have to work out and realize those rights through discussing them, through, you know, arguing about them, through fighting for them, and so on, but that not to lose hope, not to lose conviction, and not to become pessimistic. And then the second lesson, which is a little in tension with that, is to be always vigilant, and also never to sort of rest on the laurels of the movement, to always be ready to innovate and change. So the example that that David gave, and in the last question of, well, switching focus, having to find more congenial and more sort of suitable forums when one kind of venue for reform has become less promising, but also to keep thinking of new approaches, new strategies. So even what's happening with climate change, it's moved from being seen as some big issue for the climate scientists and the heads of state, to one which is deeply significant in human rights terms, which affects everyone, where we've started thinking differently about human rights when looking at rights through the lens of climate change and so on. And similarly with digital issues, to always be vigilant, to innovate, to cast off old assumptions and expectations. So not giving up on rights, not giving up on the basic framework and set of beliefs and commitments, the commitment that everyone as a human being is entitled to have their dignity, their freedom, their equality, and their welfare respected in all the ways that the body of international human rights law requires. But that the ways that we have to realize this and fight for it, and the issues involved and so on, will have to change, because the world is changing dramatically, and we have to adjust and innovate and always be ready to think outside the box. So I think those would be the two messages that I would give.
We'll share those with our students. Thanks very much, Gráinne. David has a question about vaccine mandates. In Germany today announced the imposition of a lockdown for unvaccinated people. According to David, to lesser extreme vaccine mandates, he says, have been introduced in the US, appear to be resisted by the courts. Well, public health is obviously vital. Do you have a view on how we protect the human rights of unvaccinated people? And of course, at the time of polarization in the debate, and that's a really challenging one. Any thoughts on that, Gráinne, from your experience in the States or your study?
I mean, it isn't something I studied. It is a very, very challenging one, obviously, because there's this overwhelming public health imperative. And often in those contexts, it's very easy to ride roughshod over things. We've seen that in terms of national security and so on. So I think it's an important perspective to keep in mind, the rights of the unvaccinated. It's also, though, very important, to remember that the rights of a minority also can't compromise the rights of the majority, or the health of the majority, so that there has to be a balance. I mean, I do believe in that human rights and human rights law has the right kind of framework for adjusting between the rights of minorities and of the public, and between the different types of rights involved. They're never easy questions, and I think already many different courts all over the world have come to slightly different kinds of conclusions about them. But I think there is a framework there, a proportionality analysis that really takes into consideration that, this certain public health measures impose a cost on others, and to find ways of mitigating that cost or adjusting for it, and not just sweeping that concern aside in the rush or the panic to deal with the overriding problem. That's not a very specific answer, it's a general one.
Well, it's a very challenging question indeed. So thank you for that, Gráinne. Sinead has a question about human rights issues generally. Issues seem very diverse. If we, for example, sometimes we categorize them as travelers' rights, rights of asylum seekers. Taking into account what you have been sharing with us this evening, should organizations focus on discrete, smaller issues that people can identify with, rather than pursuing campaigns that seem overly broad or amorphous? Any thoughts on that big one question as well, Gráinne?
I mean, I think they can do both, and that it also depends very much on the organization. There are so many different kinds of organizations, and some are focused on discrete issues, and others take a much broader sweep, the amnesties and the, human rights watches and so on. But I think that there can be, often very gratifying successes with more focused campaigns because they're tractable and manageable and so on. But with some of the really big issues of the day, I mean, sometimes you just have to join forces with others in a wider campaign. It's not even so much that they're amorphous as they're just so complex and challenging. But that's, I think, where collaboration is a really important is an important thing to keep in mind as well. One of my colleagues here in New York, Cesar Garavito, works a lot on this, on the idea of stimulating collaboration between different kinds of human rights organizations that have so often competed as though they were private sector firms, competing for the market, rather than working together and, not seeing their successes as, zero sum vis-a-vis another organization. So I think both concrete focused campaigns where you can really get a result that's visible and satisfying, and the broader, really important, wider campaigns like on inequality or digitalization or climate are really important, and that figuring out how to collaborate, who to collaborate with, how to work with social movements and so on, that those are the keys, I think, to effective campaigning.
Thanks, Gráinne, and that certainly resonates with us in FLAC because it's so important with the limited resources any of us as civil society organizations have, that we do engage in that collaboration. Anastasia has a question about racism, Gráinne, and she says that systemic racism or racism didn't feature in the talk, and that also that you spoke about attitudinal change, but here and elsewhere this, she says, cannot replace real implementation of legislation and policies. And she refers, by way of example, to the public sector duty. Any thoughts on that? And I know in the book you do touch on racism in certain places, but it's obviously one of the big issues of the day as well. Yes, and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think race and racial justice is one of those issues where, at least I'm thinking of the US now, but where, I mean, legal reform has been in place for so long, but it's really only the last few years, the kind of uprising with Black Lives Matter and then various other racial justice movements that have grown out of it, that, it's become clear that, well, in that case, legal reform predated the changing of attitudes and really didn't achieve what the law would suggest. So with sort of school integration or police violence and so on, racism was deep rooted in these, even though there were all kinds of laws and policies, in place. So I think the two really go together. I think, when I think about, the abortion laws in Ireland, it took a change, but that was because it required a popular referendum to bring about the legal change. But it took a change in social attitudes before the law could change. In the case of race, I think it's often possible to have to put laws and policies in place, but it can be a very long time before public officials, society, people change also their attitudes. So, social change can be the hardest thing and the slowest in many cases. But I think it's a really, really crucial component. It's not that lawyers can do all the social movement change themselves, but they need to realize that it has to be accompanied. They have to somehow work with others who are engaged in that kind of social mobilization, because otherwise the legal changes remain, paper changes, law changes, but not policies, practices, attitudes too.
Yeah, thanks, Gráinne. And again, constructive collaboration is important there, and modesty on the part of, the lawyers and everyone engaging in that process. Kate has a question, Gráinne, about the promotion of active economic citizenship. There's an argument that building a real understanding of economics among the public is the first step to achieving change on bigger issues like socioeconomic equality, and that as part of this, lawyers and activists should improve their understanding of economics. That's a question that hits home.
Yeah. I completely agree. As someone who grappled very late in life with economic issues, I totally agree with that, we're in the same way that maybe with climate, we were kind of befuddled by the science and the lack of understanding. The same is true with economic issues, that we tend to think of it, you know, that's for the experts, or if they say that interest rates, you know, have to be raised or can't be raised or whatever, then who are we to question that? And if we don't understand the nature of, you know, taxation policy and distributive issues, how can we engage with that debate? So I completely agree with that. I think that, you know, basic economic education, economic literacy would be incredibly important, just so that there's less of that, the experts and us, and having to just accept policies as they are because economic models tell us so, without really us being able to understand or challenge or question what those economic models, what assumptions are built into them.
Thanks. And it strikes me, Gráinne, that building that kind of strong civic culture is an important bulwark against some of the movements that you talk about in the book. We've got a lot more questions, and sorry that we're not able to get to them, but we've run out of time now. But Gráinne, thank you so much for the lecture, first and foremost, but also for sharing so generously with your insights in the questions and answers. I know I certainly found it a fascinating lecture, and it's something that gives us in FLAC great food for thought. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody for attending this evening.
Well, thanks very much to you too, David. It's been a pleasure to join.
Thank you.